Good morning, friends. Yesterday morning, I was going for a walk, listening to a sermon by a preacher named Paul Washer, and the sermon was on evangelism. But instead of talking about techniques and methods of evangelism, Paul Washer went to the Beatitudes and the teachings surrounding the Beatitudes. Do you remember the part about being salt and light in the world? And the whole point was that we are called to be salt and light, which absolutely, of course, means that we will be doing certain things, like sharing the gospel, but it really has to start with what we are. Because, of course, we read in that section about the futility of salt if the salt stops being salty. And so for the salt to be useful, it has to maintain the qualities, the essence of what it means to be salt. And in that sermon, Paul points out that the Beatitudes are themselves, as we discovered in our own sermon series, that the Beatitudes are the qualities of what it means to be salt and light. The way in which we're going to be effective in taking the gospel to the world is by first being poor in spirit. It's by being grieved over the presence of sin, whether we're talking about another person's sin or our own sin, and so on down through the Beatitudes. And I suppose Paul Washer was actually doing more of a training seminar than he was an actual sermon, because it's several hours long, containing 3 different videos on YouTube. And so when I work through it all myself, I might just put a link to the whole training on our church Facebook page. But for the part I listened to yesterday morning, I just couldn't help but think once again how important those Beatitudes are, that these must be the qualities demonstrated in our Christian lives. And especially when it comes to that 4th Beatitude regarding our sanctification. And Paul Washer put some good emphasis on this as well, and it's been on my mind a lot, because we're reminded that blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. We remember that we need the righteousness of Christ at work within us. And so the question is, do we hunger and thirst for that righteousness in a serious way? And that's indicated to us by going back to Psalm 42, the first few verses. A familiar psalm, I'm sure if you've never read it in the scriptures, you've probably heard a song that talks about it. But it goes like this, at least the first part of it. As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? Now, these 2 verses express a deep and even desperate desire to not only grow closer to God, but to see God, to be with Him. And that goes hand in hand with hungering and thirsting for His righteousness. And this is convicting to me, friends. Looking back over my life, I can tell you about the times where I was desperate for lots of different things. As a child, I was so often desperate for a new toy or a game. As a teenager, I'll humble myself enough to admit that far more than was healthy, I was desperate for a girlfriend. And as an adult, I often struggle with a desperate desire to just do what I want to do. But how often am I truly desperate to know more about God? Because believe me, I want to know more about God. I want to see Him one day. I want to be righteous in the way He's called me to be righteous. But it's so easy for those desires to be real desires. I really want them. But for them still to fall into the same pack of all the other desires that have influence over our lives. And so the question is, does my desire for God and for His righteousness, does it reach the point of being desperate? When the deer pants for streams of water, the panting indicates desperation, because without those streams of water, the deer is going to die. Does my soul thirst for God and His righteousness just as desperately? As a church body, as individual Christians, where are we in answering that question for ourselves? Because something that you are desperate for is going to work its way to the very top of the priority list. It won't let anything else go before it. And yet we have so many distractions that vie for that place of top priority, don't we? But He is the God of life. God is the God of life. He's the one who provides the streams of living water, of life-giving water. Jesus Christ is Himself the bread of life. And He is the only way, the only truth, the only life. No one comes to the Father of life, but through Him. So the question for us today is, are we desperate for the righteousness of Christ to be in our lives, and for Him to be the primary and only motivating and enabling factor in our lives? If you'll forgive the pun, I just want to leave this with you as food for thought for today. I love you guys. Have a good and godly day, and I can't wait, Lord willing, to see you soon.